Months after the revolution began at Lexington and Concord, the redcoats and militias prepared for battle. Unlike back in April, where both sides didn't expect a fight, the opposing armies drew up war plans and prepared to battle for the key terrain around Bunker Hill. The American Continental Army had yet to be fully formed, and at this point it was still only militias from across New England who fought the regulars. The British Army, while confined to Boston, was still a force to be reckoned with, and the battle they were about to engage in would shape the future of the Revolutionary War. Hello everyone, today we're going to be looking at the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the first major battles of the Revolutionary War. I covered the start of the war in my video on Lexington and Concord, which you can watch here. I recommend checking that out for more details kind of leading up to Bunker Hill. And this is of course coming out on the weekend after the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, which happened in June of 1775, 250 years ago. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit notification bell, do all that fun stuff, and let's just get right into it. To understand the dynamics here, we have to understand the basic geography of the Boston area. Unlike the modern metropolis, replete with tunnels, bridges, and skyscrapers, 18th century Boston was mostly underwater and the surrounding area quite rural. At the time, Boston was essentially an island, only being connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land to the south. The surrounding Boston harbor was hemmed in by two peninsulas to the north and south. To the south was Dorchester, and to the north was Charlestown. Both areas were hilly and rural, but neither were occupied by either side. The English, who fled the battle at Concord, had retreated to Charlestown instead of Boston, but shipped back into the city the next day to make resupply and support easier. The Massachusetts militias in turn occupied the Roxbury Heights past the neck, as well as the mainland to the west in order to hem the British in. Neither side took Dorchester or Charlestown, since they didn't want to overextend their lines, and the terrain didn't have much strategic advantage at the time. For now, the English were safe. The Boston Neck was narrow and easily defensible, and there was no way the rebels could enter the city without taking enormous casualties. Plus, England had the most powerful navy in the world, and various Royal Navy ships were docked at Boston, allowing its inhabitants to maintain some level of sea supply while also serving as an additional form of artillery. Nonetheless, General Thomas Gage and his redcoats, as well as the rest of the civilian population of Boston, were under siege. They did still have access to the sea, and unarmed civilians fleeing or entering the city were allowed to come and go, but without reliable access to food and fuel, they were in a precarious position. However, on through May, British reinforcements arrived alongside capable generals William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. The British forces swelled to 6,000 men, and the English now had a better chance at breaking out of Boston. At the same time, the American Revolution was gaining steam. Through April and May, word of the battle spread across the colonies. From across New England, militia units arrived to bolster the Massachusetts militias, swelling their numbers to as much as 20,000 through the summer. However, there wasn't clear command of the whole force, and many men had arrived expecting a quick fight and didn't bring any rations or supplies. For months, entire units left and sometimes returned back to the siege, often without informing their superiors of their whereabouts. The army was short on weapons, and poor hygiene led to many disease casualties, while fighters less dedicated to the cause deserted and never returned. But in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was meeting to discuss a path forward. While the Congress would also seek peace, they decided that in order to improve their position, they needed an organized army. On June 14, 1775, they established the Continental Army to be formed from existing forces around Boston and draw from men across the colonies. The next day, the Congress appointed George Washington to be the leader of the new army, but he would not get there in time. He also shared his rank with Dr. Joseph Warren, the head of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, who was already in the area. Back in Boston, the English generals came up with a plan. Rather than try to push through the neck, they would land to the south at Dorchester, then flank the American forces. The Americans had yet to demonstrate their ability in open battle, and the English were confident that it could rout the forces at Roxbury before finishing off the rebels in a pincer movement at Cambridge. However, the Americans learned about this, thanks to the New Hampshire Committee of Safety, as well as the free movement of refugees through the neck. The colonists learned of the plot on June 13th. The attack was planned for 5 days later, and the Americans had to act fast. So on the night of June 16th, 1775, over 1,200 militiamen went to fortify the heights on the Charlestown Peninsula. The Charlestown Peninsula was about a mile long and almost as wide north to south. A narrow spit of land connected it to the mainland, while Boston lay across the harbor about 500 yards away to the south. The southern coast of the peninsula was taken up by the city of Charlestown, at this point largely abandoned. Unlike today, most of the peninsula was farmland, split into dozens of plots that grew crops and grazed cattle. The plots were often separated by roads, but also fences or low stone walls, and since the field had yet to be harvested, the grasses were about waist high and made movement across them very difficult. For the battle, the most important part of the peninsula was the topography. On the easternmost jut was Moulton's Hill, about 35 feet high, not much of a hill, I know, but the next two hills, and their names, are the cause of legendary confusion. To the northwest, near the neck, was the largest hill of the peninsula at about 110 feet high. In the south lay another hill about half as high, with its sharpest slope facing south towards the city. Today, this southern hill is called Breed's Hill, and this is where most of the fighting happened. This larger hill in the north is Bunker Hill. That's right, Bunker Hill didn't actually have any fighting, even though the battle is named for it. To be fair, these hills didn't always have the same formalized names as today, and there was even some confusion at the time. For example, this famous British map of the Siege of Boston from 1775 shows the names of the hills switched. Sometimes at the time it didn't even have a distinct name since it wasn't that tall, and it was kind of connected to Bunker Hill, so sometimes they were just the same hill. Besides the hills, the lowest point of the peninsula towards the east also played a role, where the ground gave way to a marshy area between Charleston Point and the other two hills. Along the edge of the peninsula was also a beach, which was largely covered at high tide, but became wider at low tide, making this a possible avenue of movement as the battle progressed. The American plan was simple: fortify the heights at Charlestown to make it more defensible, and also threaten the city with bombardment. This would force the English to redirect their attention to the north instead of the south, giving the Americans a chance to fight from a prepared, well-defended position on good terrain, rather than in open formation where they may be beaten tactically by the English. If the Americans prevailed here, they could then bombard Boston and its port, forcing a surrender and possibly winning the war. The American Major General of the whole army at this point, Artemas Ward of Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, commanded Connecticut Brigadier General Israel Putnam to take control of Bunker Hill for that purpose. At around 9 p.m. on June 16th, Pepperell, Massachusetts native Colonel Samuel Prescott, along with 12 to 1,400 men, set off for Bunker Hill. Mostly these were Massachusetts soldiers with a contingent of 200 Connecticut men. But upon getting to Bunker Hill, they realized that Breed's would actually be a better place to bombard the city from. Through the night, Prescott led the men in creating a redoubt on the hill. This played to his men's strengths, who were more used to manual labor than fighting, and by the time the sun rose in the early morning of June 17th, the Massachusetts regiments had largely completed a square earthen redoubt on the top of the hill. The British, meanwhile, realized what was going on as the sun came up and an initial volley at sunlight from the HMS Lively fired at the redoubt, but this was stopped when English Admiral Graves complained about losing sleep, although this was quickly reversed. They knew that they had to do something about the new American positions, and two plans were proposed. General Clinton argued for an amphibious landing at the Charlestown Neck that would isolate the Americans there, cutting them off from supplies and forcing a surrender. Generals Howe and Burgoyne preferred to land on the east end of the island, then march on the American positions and push them off the hill. Clinton's siege plan was actually shot down on the grounds that the English forces would be sandwiched between the American forces, possibly resulting in disaster. So they went with the plan to assault from the east. But first, the English decided to utilize their firepower against the Americans. Not long after sunlight, all of their ships in the harbor, as well as fortifications on Pops Hill in northeast Boston, opened fire. For hours, intense bombardment came towards Prescott and his men as they continued to dig, scaring many of his men and slowing the progress. Despite all the fire, only one American was killed, decapitated by a cannonball. The hill was too high for the ships to really hit accurately, and the British guns in Boston were too far away to be effective. Prescott tried to maintain his men's morale, walking on top of the redoubt wall to show he wasn't afraid, and instructing his men to bury the dead soldier. The mostly ineffective English bombardment proved to be the least of the Americans' worries. Supply and discipline were far more destructive factors, and the battle in many ways can be seen as a race to see which army could stop shooting itself in the foot first. The other casualty of the English bombardment was the last of the American water supply, and it would take a long time for resupply to reach the Americans in the redoubt. Fear and thirst drove many men to desert and move back to Bunker Hill, where General Putnam was trying to organize reinforcing units while also trying to fortify the hill as a fallback position. Meanwhile, the British boarded barges to ferry towards Charlestown at Moulton's Point. Quote, "The sun was shining in meridian splendor, and the scarlet uniforms, the glistening armor, the brazen artillery, the regular movement of the boats, the flashes of fire, and the belchings of smoke formed a spectacle brilliant and imposing." By 1 p.m., 1,500 Englishmen were on the east end of the peninsula at Moulton's Point, preparing to engage the Americans. But rather than attack right away, the men sat down to eat after coming off the hill, as General Gage sent for reinforcements. This critically gave time for the Americans to draw up their own reinforcements and protect the flanks of the hill. In Charlestown itself, snipers were set up to harry the English, and to the north, Connecticut troops under Captain Knowlton set up a defensive line along a fence, reinforcing it for cover, and more Connecticut men set up a series of 3 flechettes, or arrow-shaped earthen walls, to try and connect the two lines diagonally. Artillery also made it up to the line. However, most of the reinforcements sent to the lines never actually made it. Some never even crossed the Charlestown Neck for fear of the English bombardment, which raked the narrow isthmus. And many who did cross stayed at Bunker Hill with General Putnam, who furiously tried to send troops forward while also taking some men to keep them on that hill to fortify it. The complete lack of discipline was obvious in the American forces, and most units refused to fight or even move to the lines to supply their comrades. In one salient moment, Putnam rode up to Prescott's men at the redoubt around noon. He demanded that some of his men take up the entrenching equipment to bring back to Bunker Hill, but Prescott refused that, stating that if his men were given license to leave, they would never come back. Putnam overrode him, and many of Prescott's men took up spades and shovels to move to Bunker Hill, and very few, if any, actually returned back to the battle. One of the few exceptions of this broken discipline were the 2 New Hampshire regiments sent to reinforce the north of the American line, commanded by Colonels James Reed and John Stark. Stark and Reed solidified the American line and even extended it. As the tide went out, the beach was beginning to be exposed and provided an avenue of approach for the English. Stark had his men build a small stone wall all the way to the water, and then placed a stake about 100 feet in front of it, ordering his men to not fire until the British reached that point. At the line, Generals Joseph Warren and Seth Pomeroy joined the fray and fought as infantry, boosting the morale of the men greatly. General Putnam also came to command artillery by the rail fence. The Americans now had a strong defense, and by 3:30, when Howe got his reinforcements, the true battle commenced. For both sides, the standard weapon was the Shortland pattern or Brown Bess flintlock musket. While modern consensus varies, it is generally agreed that a Brown Bess musket could hit a man with a .75 caliber ball reliably at 100 yards. Armies would still fire at each other past this distance, however, since it was still likely to hit many men in formation with dozens of your guns firing at once. Trained soldiers could fire 2 to 3 times a minute. On the American side, fowling pieces or hunting guns were also used. These guns could act just like a Brown Bess musket. These weapons varied in quality, barrel length, and caliber, although by and large they functioned just like a standard musket. The main weapons that distinguished the forces from each other were on total opposite ends of the spectrum. Some American units were equipped with rifles. Unlike muskets, rifles had spiral grooves in the barrel and fired balls that fit flush. This made loading harder, however, it also made the guns more accurate, capable of hitting people at over 300 yards. On the British side, the primary difference maker was the bayonet. 17 inches long with a triangle cross-section, these were formidable weapons at close range. Very few Americans had bayonets in the battle, and no redcoats had rifles. Both sides used cannons in the fighting of various sizes. On the field of battle, both sides likely used bronze cannons, which were lighter and thus easier to move, but had shorter range since the soft metal couldn't take as much powder to launch the ball. The British had 5 6-pounder guns. They also used grape shot, which fired multiple smaller balls like a shotgun, but these had much shorter range, only a couple of hundred yards. The Americans had 6 guns, and we don't know their exact size, but they were likely smaller, only 3 or 4-pounders. The British also used guns on their ships and in Boston itself, although these played less role in the fighting. The British also had a couple of different types of soldiers, light infantry and grenadiers. Light infantry were men that were faster and in better shape than others. Grenadiers, on the other hand, were bigger and stronger men, best used as shock troops for close-range combat. The British also used Marines. All of these men were equipped with the same weapons except for the light infantry, who also had a hatchet. Grenadiers also carried heavier packs, which played a difference in the battle. More important than the weapons in this battle were the formations. The basic unit in both militaries at this time was the company. In the British Army, a company tended to be between 40 to 60 men, but British Marines had a different form of organization with companies of over 100 men. On the American side, there were some variation as well. Massachusetts and New Hampshire regiments had about 60 men each, but the Connecticut companies were larger, around 100 men. Each company was headed by a captain. 10 of these companies, between 500 and 1,000 men, made up a regiment. Each regiment was headed by a colonel. Above the colonels were generals who commanded multiple regiments, indirectly. Once again, Connecticut is a weird one, since it also had their generals control one of those regiments directly, instead of leaving it for a colonel. For this battle, a couple of different formations were used, lines and columns. Lines were long, shallow formations meant to increase the number of men who could shoot at once. Columns were deeper but narrower, and less men could shoot at once, but also less men could be shot at once. Columns were better for troop movement and were also used for attacking fortified positions, since it was faster and less men were exposed to the enemy at once, allowing the first ranks to pretty much just be human shields for everyone else. Zooming back into the battle itself, both sides committed around 3,000 men to the battle. However, they didn't all fight, and getting more specific than this is difficult. On the American side, estimates after the battle ranged wildly. According to historian Richard Frothingham, a colonel in the battle gave the number at 3,000 to 3,500, General Putnam put it at 2,200, Washington, after the battle, reported 1,500 fighting at any given time, and an English pamphlet published that year put it at 3,000. By my count, a scattering of about 3,000 men defended the lines at various points in the battle. In Charlestown itself, sniping at the British were around 180 men of 3 companies, mainly based on the main street. Another 3 companies guarded the south side of the hill from behind a fence, a bit back from the main redoubt, where it wasn't as steep and exposed. The main brunt of the American force was in the redoubt in neighboring breastwork on top of the hill, under Colonel Prescott, and this was about 1,300 to 1,500 men. The main redoubt was an earthen fort about 45 yards square with 6-foot walls, an entrance in the north, and an angle to the south. Just north of that was a earthen breastwork about 100 yards long, and there was a gap between these 2 places. Just north of that was then a diagonal line, and no one really agrees if this was just a rail fence or if there was actual flechette fortifications put here. Either way, this was about a 200-yard span and was considered the weakest part of the line. Captain Thomas Knowlton of Connecticut commanded about another 300 men just north of the redoubt. About 200 yards back, where the land was flatter, was the rail fence, which was half stone and half wood, and it was actually stuffed up with straw by the Americans to make it look like it was actually fortified. And Colonels Reed and Stark commanded a bit under 1,000 New Hampshire men on the north end of the line. That being said, some men left before the battle, so that number may be closer to 2,500 or even lower at the beginning. The 6 American cannons were in 2 main places. 2 were on the rail fence, while the other 4 fired from between the main breastwork and the redoubt on the hill. The British, meanwhile, likely committed around 2,000 to 2,500 men to start the battle, roughly split between a northern and southern effort. Both of these wings were generally of equal size throughout the battle, and then reinforcements arrived later on to make the total number between 2,500 and 3,000. They also had 5 6-pound cannons. Around 3 p.m., the British attacks began. The plan was simple. Gage would lead 20 companies, half grenadiers and half light infantry, along the flatter northern part of the peninsula and beach in the main effort, while General Pigot would lead a force to feint up the east slope of Breed's Hill, using light infantry, grenadiers, and marines. Once pushed through, he would turn the American flank and attack the hill from the north, winning the battle and taking the redoubt. Howe was aware of the cost of this battle and reinforced this to his men. Quote, "If the enemy will not come from their entrenchments, we must drive them out, at all events, otherwise the town of Boston will be set on fire by them. Remember, gentlemen, we have no recourse to any resources if we lose Boston, but to go on board our ships, which will be very disagreeable to us all." However, the plan faltered horribly. The first issue was the environment. Between Moulton's Point and the hill was a low, swampy area, and the uncultivated fields made it difficult to see this, as well as the other small divots and low fences in the ground. Plus, the men had their full packs and their hot cotton uniforms, making them extremely tired and dehydrated in the summer heat. The American snipers in the town also harried Pigot's men in the south before they even began to march, and Gage ordered the town to be burnt, driving many of the Americans away and setting the town ablaze. To cover the British approach, the British cannons were moved off of Moulton's Hill closer to the Americans in the north, but they were slowed and bogged down by the swampy and fenced ground. To make matters worse, 12-pound shot was brought rather than 6-pound shot, forcing the English to use grape instead. They fired on the American line, but from long distance, and did little damage due to the ammunition's ineffectiveness at range. As the column of light infantry marched down the beach, the Americans under Stark held their fire, obeying his command to only fire once they reached the stake he had put in the ground. As they came into range, the Americans unleashed a deadly volley, decimating the light infantry column and quickly forcing them to retreat. Through the battle, the Americans were told to aim for officers in their nicer clothes, decapitating their command structure. The Grenadier line next to them met a similar fate, under fire from the New Hampshire and Connecticut regiments. The Grenadiers tried to fight in line formation, Entire companies lost over 9/10 of their strength, and the American officers encouraged their men to aim for the belt buckle. That way, even shots that went high would still be lethal. Further south, Pigott's men were similarly repulsed. Since his attack was a feint, he had his men exchange fire with the Americans at range as well. The Americans largely held strong until they came close, exposing the redcoats to withering fire. Quote, "The Americans, being protected by their works, suffered but little, but their murderous balls literally strewed the ground with dead and wounded of the enemy. General Pigot was obliged to order a retreat when the exulting shout of victory rose from the American lines. Within a few minutes, the British retreated and regrouped. The American casualties were light, but poor discipline meant that many men were leaving the lines to the safety of Bunker Hill. At the same time, General Putnam furiously tried to send more reinforcements to battle and turn around deserters, but to little avail. Soon after, Gage organized another attack. He tried the same thing, but this time he was able to bring his 6-pounders further forward, and they were more effectual against the rail fence. As Charlestown blazed in the background, the redcoats stepped over their dead and dying comrades like logs, their bright scarlet coats easier to spot in the high grass than other obstacles. And now ensued one of the greatest scenes of war that can be conceived. To fill the eye, a brilliantly appointed army advancing in the attack and storming the works, supported by cooperating ships and batteries, the blaze of the burning town, the air filled with clouds of dense black smoke, and the surrounding hills, fields, roofs, and steeples occupied by crowds of spectators. To fill the ear, the shouts of the contending armies, the crash of the falling buildings, the roar of the cannon, mortars, and musketry. To fill the mind, the high courage of men staking not only their lives, but their reputation on the uncertain issue of a civil war, and the intense emotions of the near and dear connections standing in their presence, and on the other side, the reflection that a defeat of the regulars would be a final loss to British Empire in America. Yet, in the strange contrast to this terrific scene, the day was calm and clear, nature in its beauty and repose smiling serenely upon it all, as if in token of the triumphant end of the great conflict. This second attack also failed, and the English once again had to retreat. Like the last assault, the redcoats stood at range and exchanged fire with the Americans rather than charge their lines. General Howe, for his part, led his men from the front and was almost standing alone after American volleys, having been one of the lucky few to survive the onslaught. The Americans, meanwhile, were almost out of ammo, and the number of men fleeing the field was astounding. Even before the battle, many men didn't have enough ammo. Stark's men, for example, were making balls of requisitioned organ backings from a local church. Some estimates place the number of Americans still on the line from the third attack at only 800, of which 150 were in the main redoubt. As the American lines withered, the English paused and reinforced before their third attack. General Clinton arrived from Boston with another 500 Marines and was able to rally about 200 ambulatory wounded for the last push. This time, Pigot, Pitcairn, and Clinton would lead the main assault up Breed's Hill, with Gage next to them targeting the neighboring breastwork. A much smaller force pushed towards the rail fence. The British cannons also moved up and now enfiladed the breastwork and entrance to the redoubt, forcing many Americans to retreat from the field or enter the fortification. The redcoats marched in column formation, and at around 4:30, now numbering more than 2,000 with all their casualties, they pushed up the slope, this time with their packs dropped and their bayonets fixed. Instead of exchanging fire at the range like before, they were ready to assault the redoubt and push the Americans off the hill. As the British marched, the Americans held their fire, with the last of their ammo, which they had to take from cannon cartridges since they were so low. The Americans fired at the closing redcoats, shredding their front ranks, but it wasn't enough. Prescott ordered all his men with bayonets to the walls, while the rest gathered in back of the redoubt to fire on the British who scaled the wall. The first wave of redcoats over the wall were killed to a man by a volley, and a similar fate met the next. But then the Americans ran out of ammo and resorted to throwing rocks. Sensing that their enemy was on their last legs, the British scaled the walls in force with a brutal melee, during which Major Pitcairn was killed being shot multiple times on the wall by some of the last American discharges of the battle. The Americans fled in relatively good order out of the redoubt, while Prescott fended off bayonets with his sword, later discovering multiple stabs in his coat. It was during this time that most of the Americans were killed, fleeing in orderly fashion from the defenses as the English shot them as they fled. Dr. Joseph Warren, technically a major general, was shot in the head in the onslaught, and while he didn't technically receive this commission until 2 days later, he was of equal rank to Washington and was the highest ranking person killed in the war. To the north, Colonel Stark had his men conduct an orderly retreat, ensuring that they couldn't come around and flank the redoubt. Only the horribly wounded Americans were captured, a sign of just how well run this retreat was. The Redcoats had the hill by 5 p.m. and planned on pushing even further. By the evening, the entire American force, including the thousands who never fought in the battle, had retreated from Charlestown to the safety of the main American lines. General Clinton initially advocated for pushing their momentum onto the mainland, but as evening approached, they decided to hold their ground. The English carried the day, but at horrendous cost. The Americans only suffered 115 dead and 305 wounded and 30 captured, with a casualty rate of between 13 and 30%. By contrast, 226 British died and 828 were wounded, for a massive casualty rate of 35 to 42%. Plus, 34 officers were killed and another 104 wounded, a massive chunk of the officer corps. It was the deadliest battle of the whole war, and a textbook example of a Pyrrhic victory for the Brits. For all their losses, the English had taken the hill and the wider Charlestown Peninsula. In the short and medium term, that had saved Boston from bombardment and extended the time in which they could stay in the city, which they would occupy for exactly another 9 months. However, the Charlestown neck was too narrow to effectively let the English launch any more offensives, and they had only bought themselves time, nothing more. A couple of weeks after the fighting, George Washington arrived to assume command of the new Continental Army. The importance of Bunker Hill was not tactical, but operational and strategic. As we just talked about, the only real gain the English got from the battle was securing one of 2 weak spots in the defense of Boston. That being said, the Americans were robbed of a decisive potential victory. But operationally, the battle sent shockwaves through the English plans for suppressing the rebellion. The original plan that the English conceived of to defeat the Americans was put on hold indefinitely. If they had lost so many men trying to take a less important hill from poorly organized troops, just how bad might the next fight be? General Clinton, who won the day with his reinforcements, famously wrote in his diary, quote, "A few more such victories would have surely put an end to the British dominion in America." As it turns out, canceling the Dorchester plans were incredibly important. 9 months later, the Americans would seize the Dorchester Heights for themselves and force the British to evacuate the city, now under threat of the American heavy artillery, handing Washington his first victory of the war. This same chilling effect on the British also had deep strategic importance for the whole war. The Americans proved that Lexington and Concord wasn't a fluke. It proved that the Continentals could stand up to the Redcoats in open battle and do a good enough job to make them think twice. Interestingly, the battle was very much seen as a failure by the Americans at the time, so it didn't necessarily give them that much confidence, but nonetheless secured the win months later at Boston, which did inspire confidence. This confidence was especially important through 1776, when Washington was royally trounced in the New York campaign, and even his closest advisors murmured about replacing him. Washington was barely able to keep the army together, both during the Boston siege and in the aftermath of the New York campaign. And had the morale of the army been lower, say, without the example of Bunker Hill and the siege proving they were still in the game, who knows how the rest of the war could have gone. While it is hard to rank battles by how decisive they were, I think Bunker Hill is in the running for one of the most important of the whole war. Bunker Hill is as, if not more, operationally important than Lexington and Concord in my opinion, At the very least, I think it is safe to say that the Battle of Bunker Hill is without a doubt the most important battle that the Americans lost, maybe in all of history. 5 months later, George Johnstone, an English statesman initially quite sympathetic to the Americans, delivered an amazing speech to the British House of Commons. Even though it was written by an Englishman whose nation was at war with America, it is deeply patriotic to America and just really cool. To a mind who loves to contemplate the glorious spirit of freedom, no spectacle can be more affecting than the action at Bunker's Hill. To see an irregular peasantry commanded by a physician inferior in number, opposed by every circumstance of cannon and bombs that could terrify timid minds, calmly waited the attack of the gallant Howe, leading on the best troops in the world, with an excellent train of artillery, and twice repulsing those very troops who had often chased the chosen battalions of France, and at last retiring for want of ammunition, but in so respectable a manner that they were not even pursued. Who can reflect on such scenes and not adore the constitution of government which could breed such men? So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.